The CEO mocked a single dad. At a coffee shop, then her daughter ran into his arms. The morning the whole cafe went silent. Nobody was watching the door. They were watching the man in the corner. The one with the worn jacket, grease-darkened knuckles, and a 6-year-old girl pressed against his side, shivering in a coat that was one size too small. The most powerful woman in the room had already decided what kind of person he was. One cold look. One quiet sentence. And every person holding a latte or a leather briefcase understood exactly who she meant when she said certain people simply did not know where they belonged. But nobody had seen the little girl in the silk dress yet. And nobody was ready for what she was about to do. Stay until the end to understand why that child ran into a stranger's arms, and why the secret she carried was the one thing that could make a CEO break down and cry. The rain had been falling since before dawn, and Chicago wore it the way it always did, without apology, without warmth. By 7:45 in the morning, the streets near the Riverwalk district were already slick and gray, and the coffee shop called Ardent & Co. was filling fast with the kind of people who had standing reservations. Business cards, laminated in matte finish, and assistants who carried their umbrellas for them. Cameron Blake had not planned to come inside. He had pulled his truck over half a block away when the engine gave that particular lurch that meant the alternator was dying. Not catastrophic. He knew exactly what it needed, but it meant no heat, and Sophie was already coughing softly from the back seat, her small nose pink at the tip. The stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere clutched against her chest as though it might warm her. "Just for a few minutes," he told her. "We'll get warm, then I'll fix the truck." Sophie nodded without complaint. She rarely complained. At 6 years old, she had developed a kind of patience that sat wrong on a child, the quiet, settled patience of someone who had learned early that some things could not be rushed or fixed by crying about them. Cameron noticed it every time and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because she got it from him. The interior of Ardent & Co. was all warm amber light and exposed brick, the kind of place that charged $11 for a pour-over and made you feel underdressed for asking. Cameron was underdressed. He knew it the second he pushed through the glass door, and felt the shift in the room, that fraction of a second recalibration that happened in places like this when someone arrived who did not belong to the usual register. He found a 2-person table near the window, away from the main foot traffic, and helped Sophie out of her damp coat. She immediately set her rabbit on the table beside the sugar jar, arranging it carefully so it could see the rain outside. "Can I get hot chocolate?" she asked. "Yeah. Bug, you can get hot chocolate." He was still reading the menu, which was printed on cardstock that probably cost more than his breakfast, when the door opened again, and the temperature of the room seemed to shift in a different way. Eleanor Whitmore did not walk into rooms so much as she recalibrated them. 27 years old, dressed in a charcoal-structured coat that had never seen a sale rack, hair pinned back with the kind of precision that communicated she had zero patience for imprecision anywhere in her life. Her assistant, a young man named Derek who moved as though perpetually apologizing for his own existence, followed half a step behind her. And at her other side, holding the hand of a nanny named Mrs. Carver, was a small girl in a pale blue dress, 5 years old, dark-haired, eyes that tracked everything but landed on nothing, moving across the room in that scanning, assessing way of a child who has learned to calculate safety before relaxing into any space. Lily Whitmore. Eleanor moved directly to the reserved table near the far window, the one with the small placard and the extra-wide chair spacing, because the host knew her order and her preferences and the minimum acceptable distance between her and the nearest stranger. She pulled out her phone before she sat down. She did not look around the room in the way people do when they are simply taking it in. She looked around in the way people do when they are assessing threats. Her gaze landed on Cameron's table once, briefly, and moved on. Then Sophie reached across for the sugar jar, caught the edge of her coloring case with her elbow, and sent a scatter of crayons skidding across the polished concrete floor. A fat green one rolled under the table of a man in a charcoal suit 2 feet away. He looked down at it. He looked up at Cameron. He did not reach for it. "Sorry," Cameron said immediately. He started to push back his chair. "Sophie, let's pick those up." Sophie had already slid off her seat and was on her knees, gathering the crayons with both hands, her rabbit tucked under her arm. She was quick about it, efficient, the way she always was when she sensed she had caused inconvenience. That quiet competence in a 6-year-old always made Cameron's chest ache in a way he could not entirely name. The suited man said nothing but shifted his chair pointedly. Cameron felt the look. He had been getting that particular look, in various forms, since the day his truck first needed new tires he could not afford. It was the sound of Eleanor's voice that made everyone go still, not loud. That was the thing. She did not need volume. The sentence arrived perfectly modulated, addressed to no one in particular but designed to carry, the way certain instruments carry even in a crowded room. Some people truly don't know where they belong. She had not even looked up from her phone. The cafe absorbed it, the way rooms absorb a dropped fork the instant of absolute quiet. Then the gradual return to noise. But the quiet was enough. The man in the charcoal suit straightened. The barista behind the counter looked at his hands. Sophie, still on her knees, paused in gathering the last crayon. Cameron said nothing. He had spent years in firehouses learning to read the particular quality of silence before a structure gave way. He recognized this silence for what it was, and he let it pass. He helped Sophie back into her chair. He stacked the coloring case neatly at the edge of the table. He waited until a young barista came over, not the host, just a barista who had seen the whole thing and looked embarrassed on behalf of everyone, and asked quietly if she could bring a damp cloth for the floor. The host appeared a moment later with that carefully neutral expression that meant he had been asked to intervene and was hoping it would resolve itself without any of the words actually having to be said. Cameron looked at him steadily. "I know," he said. "We won't be long." Sophie was watching her father's face. She had stopped asking questions at that age, when children understand that the question itself might cause a hurt they are not equipped to handle. She picked up her rabbit and held it tighter. Then, Lily moved. Nobody saw it begin. One moment, the girl in the pale blue dress was standing at Eleanor's table, holding Mrs. Carver's hand, glancing around the room in that watchful, wary way she always did in public. The next moment, her gaze had found Cameron, and her entire body changed. It was not recognition exactly. It was something older than recognition. Something that lived beneath language. She dropped Mrs. Carver's hand. Eleanor did not notice for 3 full seconds, because she was rereading a contract clause on her phone. 3 seconds is long enough for a 5-year-old to cross a cafe. Lily was already running. The sound she made when she reached him was not a word at first. It was the sound of something finally releasing a pressure held too long in a body too small to hold it. She wrapped both arms around Cameron's waist, buried her face against his jacket, and held on with the particular ferocity of a child who had been afraid for a very long time and had decided, in the space of 3 seconds, that this was the person she had been waiting to find. Everyone in Ardent & Co. had stopped moving. Cameron Blake, who had been preparing to stand up and leave quietly, sat perfectly still with a little girl he had never met in his life, clinging to him as though he were the only fixed point in a spinning world. Eleanor was across the room in seconds, her phone already in her jacket pocket, her face stripped of every careful layer she usually wore. "Lily. Lily, sweetheart, come here. Come to Mama." Lily shook her head, not obstinately, desperately, and then she said, in the voice of a child who has been carrying something unbearable for a very long time, "Don't go away again. Please, don't go away again." The words landed on the room, like a stone on still water. Cameron's hands, which had instinctively moved to keep the child from falling, stayed perfectly gentle. He looked at Eleanor, looked at her directly, without apology, without aggression. And she saw in his face something she had not expected. She had expected confusion. Maybe manipulation. What she saw instead was a man genuinely searching his own memory for something, and not finding it. "I don't know her," he said quietly. Not defensively. Just the truth, offered plainly. Mrs. Carver had moved to Eleanor's side, whispering about whether they should call someone. Eleanor barely heard her. Lily never did this. Not with strangers, not with family friends, not with anyone. Lily had spent 2 years in therapy learning to manage the anxiety that gripped her any time she encountered an unfamiliar person. She sat close to walls in restaurants. She held her mother's hand through entire birthday parties. She had never not once run toward anyone she did not know. Lily. Eleanor crouched down, bringing herself level with the girl, her voice stripped back to something only a parent could manage in that particular moment of helpless bewilderment. "Baby, who is this?" Lily loosened her grip enough to look up at Cameron's face. She studied it the way children study something they are in the process of confirming, matching what they see against something stored deep and private. "I remember his voice," she said simply. Sophie Blake, sitting across the small table, watched all of this with the focused attention of someone taking careful inventory. She looked at the girl in the blue dress. She looked at her father's face. She slid her rabbit across the table and offered it to Lily without a word. Lily looked at it. She looked at Sophie. Something in her shoulders dropped. Cameron finally spoke again, low and careful, in the same tone he used when Sophie woke up frightened at 2 in the morning. "Hey, you're okay. No one's going anywhere right now." Lily went still. Not calm still. The way you go still when something your body has been bracing for finally does not happen. Eleanor straightened up slowly. For the first time since she had entered the cafe that morning, she had no idea what to do with her hands. 3 years earlier, a fire had torn through the 14th floor of a residential tower on the north side of the city. It began sometime after midnight, in an electrical room that building inspectors would later describe as having been improperly maintained for longer than anyone wanted to put on record. By the time the first engine company arrived, 2 apartments were fully involved, and the stairwell on the east side was compromised. Eleanor had not been in the building that night. She and her then-husband, a man named Richard, were 3 weeks into what was supposed to be a structured separation, meaning she was staying with her sister on the west side, while their lawyers circled each other politely. Lily was home with a night nurse, because Richard was traveling, and the custody schedule had not yet been formalized. Because nothing had yet been formalized, because the whole thing was falling apart too fast for paperwork. The call came at 2:17 in the morning. Eleanor could still reconstruct that night minute by minute if she needed to, and she tried very hard never to need to. What she knew was this: Lily had been found on the balcony of the 14th floor apartment, wrapped in a firefighter's jacket, holding her stuffed rabbit, completely unharmed. The night nurse had gotten out through the west stairwell with the couple from next door. Lily had been somehow, through a sequence of events Eleanor had never fully reconstructed, separated, moved to the balcony, and retrieved. The firefighter who brought her down had refused to give his name to the news team that tried to document the rescue. The watch commander on scene had described him only as one of ours, and by the time Eleanor arrived at the hospital and held her daughter and tried to piece together what had happened, the engine company had rotated out, and the specific individual responsible for the balcony rescue was somewhere in the administrative machinery of a department that had 1,700 active personnel. Eleanor had tried to find him, twice. The third time she tried, her lawyers were telling her that the custody fight was escalating, and she needed to focus, and Victor had told her the same thing, and eventually she had let it go, the way you let go of things you cannot afford to hold. But Lily had not let go. For 3 years, Lily had carried a specific voice in her memory, warm, unhurried, close in the darkness, when everything else was noise and heat and disorientation. A voice that had said, in a completely ordinary tone, as though there were nothing unusual about any of it, "I've got you. You're coming with me. Hold on to this. Cameron Blake had carried the memory of that night differently. He remembered the fire the way firefighters remember fires, by what went wrong, by where the structural behavior surprised them, by the exit routes and the timing. He remembered the child on the balcony because she had been completely silent, which was the most frightening thing a child could be in a burning building. Not screaming, not crying, just crouched in the corner with a stuffed rabbit pressed to her face, eyes enormous and dry, waiting for something. He had talked to her the entire way down. Not instructions, not reassurance exactly, just talking, in the same low, ongoing way you might talk to a frightened animal, covering the sounds of the building with the sound of a voice that had decided it was not going anywhere. He had not known her name. He had not known anything about her, except that she was small and frightened, and that it was his job to get her out of there. And then, it was done. And then there were 12 other things that needed doing, and then he was in the hospital with a fractured shoulder and 2 cracked ribs from a section of ceiling he had not seen coming. And then everything else had happened, and he had not thought about it in the specific way of remembering, because that was not how he was built. Eleanor stood in the parking lot of Ardent & Co., in the rain, watching her daughter sit across a small cafe table from a quiet, grease-stained man she had publicly insulted 20 minutes ago, and she began to understand what Lily had recognized. Not his face, his voice. The investigation Eleanor quietly commissioned took 4 days. The private firm she used for corporate due diligence returned a file that was notable for how empty it was in the categories she had been trained to look for, and how full it was in the ones she had not expected. Cameron James Blake, 28 years old, no criminal record, no civil judgments, no debt beyond the standard carrying costs of a person living one paycheck removed from a margin that most people in Eleanor's professional circle would not have recognized as a margin at all. He had joined the Chicago Fire Department at 22, been decorated twice, and resigned at 25, following a line-of-duty injury to his right shoulder that had ended his ability to perform structural firefighting. The night his wife died, he had been working. Her name had been Patricia. She had collapsed at home from a cardiac event that moved faster than anyone could have anticipated, and the cruel irony which the file noted with the dry clinical precision of someone summarizing facts was that Cameron had been half a mile away responding to a kitchen fire in a 3-flat building, and the paramedics had arrived at his apartment 6 minutes after it was already too late. Sophie had been 2 years old. She had been asleep in her crib the entire time. Cameron had not spoken publicly about any of this. He had not spoken publicly about anything. As far as Eleanor's investigators could determine, he had grieved, and reorganized, and found childcare, and learned to fix commercial espresso machines, because the licensing course was affordable, and the work was steady enough, and he could bring Sophie with him to small jobs when school was out. He had moved into a smaller apartment. He had continued to be, by every available measure, a person who did things without expecting recognition for them. Eleanor read the file 3 times. Then she looked at herself in the mirror above her office credenza, the mirror she had chosen specifically because it reflected only her face and not the room behind her, and she recognized something she had spent 27 years being too busy to examine. She had grown up in a house where worth was denominated in a very specific currency, and she had become so fluent in that currency that she had stopped noticing she was spending it on people who had never asked to be evaluated. She had looked at a man with grease on his hands and a child in a second-hand coat, and she had rendered a verdict in the time it takes to glance up from a phone. And the person she had dismissed without looking at had once carried her daughter out of a burning building. Lily asked to see him again on the 5th day. The way she asked for things she had already decided were necessary not as a request, but as a statement of fact, offered gently to someone who had the ability to make it happen. Eleanor called the number in the file. The repair shop was a narrow street-level space on a block that mixed residential buildings with small commercial storefronts in the way that particular part of the city always had unhurriedly, without visible commercial logic. The sign above the door read Blake Precision Service in vinyl letters that had been applied by someone who was better at fixing machines than at applying vinyl letters, and the window displayed a row of disassembled espresso components arranged with the same care a jeweler might use for watches. Eleanor arrived with Lily and without an assistant or a plan, which was not something she did. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, preparing something to say, and then Lily pushed the door open and walked in. Cameron was at the workbench when they entered. Sophie cross-legged on a stool beside him, drawing in a notebook, a small electric fan running quietly to push the solvent smell toward the ventilation. He looked up. He showed nothing on his face except a kind of steady attentiveness, the same quality he had had in the cafe. "I'm not here about the fire," Eleanor said, which was not the sentence she had prepared. I just... She asked to come. Lily was already standing next to Sophie, looking at the notebook. "She draws," Cameron said, meaning Sophie. And then, after a pause, "You can come in." The awkwardness between two adults who had begun badly and were rerouting in real time without a map for it settled over the shop like weather. Cameron offered coffee from a small machine he had clearly rebuilt himself. Eleanor accepted it. They did not talk about the cafe. They did not talk about the fire. They talked about the machines, because Cameron had pointed out a particular valve while he worked, and Eleanor had asked what it did, and the question had been genuine rather than strategic, which surprised both of them. Sophie and Lily moved through the careful initial phase of two children deciding about each other with the efficiency unique to that age group. By the time the adults had finished one cup of coffee, the girls were sitting together on the floor with the notebook between them, Sophie explaining her drawing system and Lily making small additions with a borrowed pencil. The broken music box was on the lower shelf, a pale green thing, with a rusted mechanism and a lid that no longer closed. Eleanor noticed Lily's eyes go to it twice. "That's from an estate sale," Cameron said. "The mechanism's stripped. I was going to see if it could be cleaned out." "Can you fix it?" Lily asked. He looked at her for a moment. "I don't know yet. Let's see." He sat down at the bench with the music box and began taking apart the mechanism in the careful, unhurried way he did everything, explaining each step in a low voice, as though the explanation were simply available for anyone who wanted it. Lily stood beside him and watched, with the focused, unself-conscious attention she gave to almost nothing outside her mother's presence. 20 minutes later, the mechanism turned. 5 clear, slightly imperfect notes rose into the air of the shop. Lily laughed, full and sudden and bright, completely unlike the careful, controlled way she engaged with the world. Eleanor's throat tightened, in a way she was not prepared for. That laugh had been gone for a long time. She could not have said exactly when she had last heard it, but she knew immediately that its absence had become something she had quietly stopped expecting to fix. On the way home, Lily sat in the back seat and looked out the window. "Mama," she said. He kept his promise. Eleanor glanced back at her. "What promise, sweetheart?" Lily considered this. He said everything was going to be okay. And it is. She paused. Mostly. Eleanor drove the rest of the way home without speaking. Victor Hale had been in Eleanor's life for 4 years, first as the attorney managing her prenuptial documentation, then as the legal architect of her separation agreement, then as what he described himself as, and she had accepted him being, an advisor, a strategist, a person whose function was to make sure her professional position remained unassailable, no matter what her personal life did. He was 41, lean, impeccably dressed in the way of someone who understood that presentation was a form of argument. He had excellent instincts for institutional politics and genuinely useful connections at every level of the business and legal structures Eleanor moved through. She had relied on him with the specific trust of someone who had been let down enough times to value competence above warmth. She did not notice, for a long time, how much that reliance had begun to resemble something she would not have consented to if it had been named directly. The day she mentioned Cameron to him not as a romantic prospect, simply as a person who had entered her daughter's life in a way she was trying to understand. Victor's response was immediate and precise. People in difficult circumstances sometimes find ways to position themselves near people with resources. It's not malicious necessarily. It's just what happens. I'd be careful. Eleanor said nothing. A firefighter who doesn't work anymore, fixing small appliances with a sick kid? He's not a bad person, Eleanor. He's just in a situation where someone like you represents a very specific kind of solution. He paused. Lily is vulnerable. You know that. The attachment thing she does, the therapist has talked about this. Some people are very good at triggering that. It was a perfectly constructed argument. It acknowledged complexity. It did not accuse. It positioned itself as caution rather than control. Eleanor almost accepted it. What stopped her was a detail so small it should not have mattered. She was recounting the visit to the shop, and she mentioned the music box. And she mentioned Lily's laugh. And Victor said, with polished concern, "A music box in a repair shop. That's convenient, isn't it?" She looked at him. "I'm just saying these things can be staged. Kids respond to things that feel magical. It doesn't mean he didn't know we were coming," Eleanor said. Victor shifted. "Just slightly." "Right. Of course." She thought about that shift for 2 days before she understood why it bothered her. Sophie saw it before any of the adults did. She was at the shop with her father. This had become a semi-regular arrangement, the two families finding a rhythm around it without formally acknowledging that was what they were doing when a car pulled up outside and a man got out. Victor, arriving unannounced. Sophie was at the window. She watched him come in, watched the way he looked at her father, with the particular expression of a person assessing an obstacle rather than greeting a stranger. And she tugged Cameron's sleeve. "Daddy," she said, quietly, "that man doesn't like you." Cameron looked at the door. "Why do you say that? He looks at you like this." She made a face that was, Cameron had to admit, a fairly precise rendering of contempt dressed up as politeness. 2 hours later, Sophie told her father she had heard the man on the phone in the parking lot before he came inside. She hadn't understood all of it. But she had understood the little girl can't be allowed to remember that night. Cameron pulled out a box he kept at the back of the closet, not because he had anything to hide, but because he had spent 3 years putting distance between himself and the part of his life that had ended the way it ended, and that distance had its own weight that he was not always sure he wanted to move. The incident reports from his department service. The commendation letters he had never framed. A note from a watch commander about the tower fire, which he had kept for a reason he could not have articulated clearly at the time. He called Marcus Webb the next morning. Marcus had been his lieutenant, retired now, living in Evanston with 2 dogs and a woodworking habit. They had not spoken in 14 months. The tower fire, Cameron said, when they had moved through the initial catch-up, the North Side building. 3 years ago. A pause. Yeah, the electrical room. The origin point. Another pause. Different in quality. That was closed as accidental. I know what the report says. Marcus exhaled. Cam, the pull station on 14. The whole East Wing suppression system. You and I both stood in that room afterward. The inspector's report. I know what the inspector's report says. I'm asking what you saw. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Cameron could hear one of Marcus's dogs moving around somewhere in the background. I saw what I saw, Marcus said finally. And I wrote what I was told to write in terms of the official record. That's all I'm going to say about it. It was enough. Cameron spent 3 days pulling things together, not confrontationally, not with any clear sense of what he was going to do with what he was finding, but with the systematic patience of someone who had been trained to assess structures for where they were weakest. He reached out to 2 other former colleagues. He searched public records for the corporate registration of the company that had managed the building's maintenance contracts in the years before the fire. The name buried 3 layers down in the subsidiary structure was not one he had expected to find. The company was controlled by a holding entity whose legal representative of record was one Victor Hale. He sat with that for a long time. Then Eleanor called. Her voice was different, tighter, lower, more controlled than even her usual control, which meant she was frightened. "Someone was in my apartment," she said. "Not a break-in. Nothing taken. But things were moved. And Lily last night she woke up at 3 in the morning and she was sitting in the middle of her room and she was shaking. She kept saying, 'The door was locked from the outside. The door was locked from the outside.'" Cameron was already putting his jacket on. He brought them to his apartment because it was the one option he could control. And Sophie, who asked no unnecessary questions, simply shifted her drawings to one end of the table and made room. The apartment was small in the way of a space that had been made to work by someone who was good at making things work clean and functional. Sophie's drawings taped to the hallway wall, a shelf of repurposed parts along one side of the living room, a second-hand couch that was nevertheless the most comfortable piece of furniture Eleanor had sat on in recent memory. Lily fell asleep on that couch within 40 minutes, with Sophie's rabbit tucked under her arm, and Sophie, sitting at the far end eating crackers and reading, maintaining proximity without intrusion, in the way that 6-year-old had apparently decided was called for. Cameron made tea and set it on the table, and did not try to fill the silence with anything that was not necessary. Eleanor looked at the shelf of repaired things. A clock. A radio. A ceramic figurine with a crack along the base, filled in with something that had dried gold. She had read about that technique, the Japanese idea of repairing with gold, making the break part of the history rather than hiding it. "You do that on purpose," she said. He looked at the shelf. "Yeah." She looked at her hands. "I owe you an apology." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Her voice did not waver, but it had something in it she rarely allowed. "I looked at you in that cafe, and I decided who you were in about 3 seconds. And I was wrong, and it wasn't even a close call. I was wrong the way people are wrong when they've stopped actually looking." Cameron was quiet for a moment. "I've done it too," he said. "Not in the same direction. But I've made up my mind about people, and then had to walk it back. You're being generous. I'm being honest. There's a difference." Eleanor looked at him, really looked. The way she had not looked in the cafe. The way she had been too busy performing certainty to look. She saw tiredness. She saw something that was not defeat, but was adjacent to it, the particular quality of a person who has been carrying something heavy for long enough, that they have learned to carry it without showing the weight. "She said you kept your promise," Eleanor said. "Lily did. On the way home from the shop." Cameron's expression shifted. "She said you told her everything was going to be okay." Eleanor paused. "I think that's the only promise anyone has kept for her in about 3 years." He did not respond immediately. When he did, it was not with anything that tried to resolve the weight of what had just been said. "She's going to be all right," he said. "Both of them are." Eleanor thought she had cried herself out of tears sometime around the end of her marriage. She had spent 2 years being too strategic for grief, too focused for collapse, too aware of who was watching to let anything fall. She found out that night, sitting in a small apartment that smelled like solder and chamomile tea, with her daughter asleep on a second-hand couch, that she had simply been deferring the bill. She did not try to stop it. It came anyway. Cameron did not make it a moment. He did not mark it or frame it or offer any words that would have turned her grief into something he was participating in. He simply stayed. The way he had learned to stay present and unhurried, close enough to matter, quiet enough to not intrude. When she finally stopped, he handed her a paper towel, which she used, which was somehow the correct thing. "I need to tell you what I found," he said. The boardroom of Whitmore Holdings occupied the 40th floor of a tower in the Loop, and on the morning of the emergency shareholder meeting, it held 22 people who had each received a notice of urgent business the previous evening. Victor arrived in a charcoal suit that matched his expression contained, prepared, the expression of a man who had been managing situations like this for 20 years. and expected to manage this one in the same way. Eleanor was already seated at the head of the table when he arrived. She did not greet him. The agenda item was a motion for leadership review, filed by 2 board members whose shares Victor had been quietly acquiring through intermediary entities for the better part of a year. The intent was procedural, but the function was a removal, and everyone in the room understood that, and half of them had been told what to vote and by whom. Victor began speaking. He was precise, measured, effective, painting a picture of leadership instability, personal disruptions, and the specific vulnerability of a company whose public-facing brand was its CEO's identity. He was 4 minutes into his prepared remarks when Eleanor opened the folder on the table in front of her. "I'd like to introduce some materials," she said, not loudly, in the exact tone she used for everything. Before we proceed to a vote, the materials included bank records, transferred in small, carefully structured increments that each fell just beneath the reporting threshold. They included correspondence between Victor's firm and the legal team representing Eleanor's ex-husband Richard during the custody dispute correspondence that had been conducted while Victor was simultaneously advising Eleanor on the same case. They included a copy of a maintenance contract for the 14th floor electrical room in the North Side Tower, bearing a subsidiary name that traced directly to Victor's holding entity, and they included the original incident report from the fire department, alongside a supplemental assessment prepared by a retired fire investigation specialist named Marcus Webb, who had signed it the previous day. Victor's expression did not break, but it hesitated. In 20 years of watching people absorb information in high-stakes rooms, Eleanor had never seen his expression hesitate. She did not speak again for a moment. The room had gone to that particular quality of silence that comes when people are doing rapid internal recalculation. Then the door opened. Cameron had been in the corridor. He came in quietly, and Lily was with him, holding his hand, wearing the same pale blue dress she had worn the morning of the cafe, because it was the dress she had asked for that morning, and Eleanor had not thought to ask why. Sophie was not with them. She was downstairs with Marcus Webb, who had agreed to wait. Lily walked to the center of the room without being led there. She looked around at the faces of 22 strangers, with the assessing, wary gaze that was her default in unfamiliar spaces. And then she found Victor. Every adult in the room saw what happened to her face when she found Victor. Not anger, not accusation. Just the simple, unmistakable fact of a child recognizing the person they are afraid of. She turned away from him. She looked up at the table, at the room, at no one in particular, and she spoke in a voice that was completely steady, the way children's voices are steady when they are saying something they have been holding for a very long time and have finally decided is safe to release. "The man who locked the door," she said. "He was on the phone. He said to wait until the smoke was bad. I remembered his shoes." She looked back at Victor. Victor said nothing. He was looking at a 5-year-old in a blue dress, with the expression of a man watching a structure collapse. "I knew his shoes," Lily said. "They were shiny." He was apprehended in the lobby on his way out by 2 investigators who had been waiting since 7 in the morning on the strength of the materials submitted through the department's Financial Crimes Division the previous afternoon. The news reached the boardroom in increments over the following hour, which the board spent mostly in silence. Eleanor kept the company, but she had already stopped thinking about the company. 4 months passed. The way good months pass, when you are paying attention to them with detail, with texture, with the specific accumulating weight of ordinary things that taken one by one seem unremarkable and taken together become the most important record of a life. Eleanor stopped scheduling herself in 15-minute increments and started leaving blocks in her calendar labeled simply morning, with nothing attached to them. The company ran without her performing it at every hour, which it had been capable of doing for longer than she had been willing to trust. She began taking Lily to her therapy appointments rather than sending her with Mrs. Carver. And she sat in the waiting room and read actual books, cover to cover. For the first time in years, Lily laughed more. Not always, not easily, but more. The nightmares came less frequently. The scanning, assessing quality of her gaze in public spaces began to soften around its edges. Cameron opened the shop, properly registered it, expanded the bench, added a second workstation for the overflow that had been accumulating since word of his work had spread through the kind of informal neighborhood network that moves faster than advertising. He hired a part-time assistant. He replaced the truck. Sophie's respiratory specialist adjusted her medication, and the adjustments worked, and one Tuesday morning she ran the entire length of the playground without stopping once. And Cameron stood at the fence watching her and said nothing because there was nothing to say. He had not looked for what was developing between himself and Eleanor. He would not have been able to point to a day when it became something, because it had not announced itself. It had arrived in the way of things that are constructed incrementally from the ground up from honesty. From watching the other person do the unremarkable things that reveal the actual shape of who they are, from the specific, accumulating evidence of two people consistently choosing to tell the truth. They did not name it before they were both sure of it. Neither of them was built for naming things before they were sure. On the morning they returned to Ardent & Co. It was a Saturday in early November, and the rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the city clean and bright in that specific way it sometimes managed after weather. The cafe had a new host. The old one had transferred to another location, apparently requesting the move the week after the morning that the daughter of Eleanor Whitmore had run across his floor and embraced a man he had been preparing to escort from the premises. Whether he had requested the move out of embarrassment or simply coincidence, no one had thought to ask. They took the table near the window, Cameron and Eleanor on one side with coffee, Sophie and Lily on the other side with hot chocolate, and a shared coloring book that Sophie had brought in a bag with the specific forethought of a child who plans ahead. Sophie's stuffed rabbit sat in the center of the table. Lily had begun carrying her own rabbit, a newer one, slightly less worn, but held with the same two-handed grip. A man approached their table, older, the day manager, someone Cameron recognized from the morning of the rain. "Mr. Blake," the man said. He had the expression of someone who had been preparing for this encounter and was committed to getting through it. "I remember you. From a few months ago." A pause. "I handled that situation badly. I'm sorry." Cameron looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "It's done." The man nodded, relieved, and moved on. Eleanor watched this exchange, then looked at Cameron. "You could have made that harder for him." "I know. Why didn't you?" He looked at Sophie, who was explaining her color-coding system to Lily with the patient. Methodical energy she brought to everything she cared about. He looked at Lily, who was listening with the focused, unhurried attention she had been learning to offer to things that were safe. He looked at Eleanor. "Because it costs too much to hold," he said, staying angry at every person who misread the situation. "I can't afford it." He paused. "Some things are worth the energy." That wasn't one of them. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, looking at the window, at the bright wet street and the light moving across the buildings. "The day we were here before," she said, "I thought I knew exactly what kind of man you were the second I looked at you." "Yeah," he said. "I know. I was wrong about almost everything." She turned back to him. There was something in her face that had not been in her face the first time she had been in this room. Something unguarded, the particular openness of a person who has decided that control is not the same as safety and is learning, slowly and deliberately, to tell the difference. "You didn't belong here because of what you own, or what you drive, or what your jacket cost." She paused. "I just hadn't met the right person to show me that yet." Cameron looked at her. A slow, quiet smile moved across his face, the kind that does not perform anything, that is simply the outward evidence of something inward and certain. "Maybe," he said. "I just hadn't found the right reason to stay." Lily reached across the table and took his hand. Not urgently, not desperately the way you take someone's hand when you have decided they are yours to hold. Sophie looked at this, and then looked at Eleanor, and then, with the complete and uncomplicated generosity of a child who knows exactly who she is, leaned sideways and rested her head against Eleanor's arm. Outside, the last of the rain had moved east. The morning light came in at an angle that turned everything on the table. The coffee cups, the coloring book, the two small stuffed rabbits sitting side by side into something luminous and ordinary, the most valuable kind of thing. The four of them sat in the late autumn sun, and the cafe moved around them, and none of them were anywhere else in the world.